Hello, welcome to Books and Brews,
the place where beer and literature meet.
With your host, certified cicerone Michael Agnew.
And Laura Vosika, author of the Bluebells Chronicles.
Each month we invite a guest author to read their words and talk about writing while sipping beers specially paired with their work.
Today's guest is Nancie Laird Young.
So sit back,
pop a cold one,
and dive into some books
and brews.
Started again. So once again, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we are in. Welcome everybody to episode 41 of the Books and Brews podcast. I'm getting better with the number, Laura. I'm remembering what the number is.
Very good. I have it written down in my notes.
Just posted episode.
This seems to be a theme.
Getting better with numbers, keeping track. Yeah. So, yes, episode number 41. We have with us today Nancie Laird. Nancie Laird Young. And do you go by Nancie Young as an author?
I go by Nancie Laird Young, but just
Nancie Laird Young.
Great.
Okay. So how's your month been, Michael?
Oh, it's been all right. Recovering from getting married.
Yeah.
We have to apply. We have to send documentation to the Japanese embassy to get our marriage recognized in Japan. So Vosika has been putting that together, sending out thank you cards.
Mm-hmm.
Been having a hard time finding the time to play banjo, which is disappointing me.
Are you doing, you're coming into your tour that's coming up.
Yeah, so I'm doing paperwork and
That's
whatnot.
taking a lot of your time.
Yeah.
Because the groom typically doesn't write thank you notes, does he? Or
I helped. I did a lot.
you do?
He's a modern man.
I actually wrote them.
Oh, wow.
And then Masako hand wrote them because my handwriting is atrocious. So I typed up the text on a computer and then she actually wrote it.
Oh, that's neat. Okay. Yeah, I'm terrible about getting anything in the mail, but we won't go there. We'll leave that. Well, we had a fun month. We went up to Two Harbors to camp for a week, and we went up to the North American Bear Center run by Lynn Rogers, based on 50 years of his research in black bears. And so I am no longer terrified to walk down my driveway. So really big deal. So for the listeners who don't know, and for Nancie who's here, recently, 11 months ago now, moved on to 29 acres in the Great North Woods. And about the day we moved into the house, I said, wait a second, there are bears here, aren't there? And Chris keeps telling me they're not going to hurt you. And so I was shocked. We actually went to the Wolf Center in Ely and the Bear Center. I was shocked at how small wolves and bears actually are. Black bears, anyway.
Black bears are small. Other bears are not necessarily small.
No, other bears are not.
You a grizzly bear or a polar bear.
No, definitely not. But I was surprised at how small a black bear is. And I know that they're the least aggressive, but I didn't realize how small they were. I looked at them. I'm like, my dog is practically bigger than these animals.
Your dog is bigger than those animals.
That's true. That's true. Every time she's impatient, I say, hold your horses. And then I go, oh, you are a horse. But yeah, we had fun. We played miniature golf up there, and it was this really cool, it's called Pets and Putts, and it has live animals all over the golf course. Like they're kind of penned, but it's really neat. The trail just works in and out among all these cages and pens with chickens, cocks, and sheep, goats, all kinds of neat. Maybe not sheep, but goats. Yeah.
Kind of like your backyard.
Like our backyard is going to be. We did get the rabbit cages up. In fact, Chris just finished hanging them on the wall in the detached garage, and we have mapped out where the goats are going to go. And so that's the next step, is to get the rabbits and then to put up the goat fencing.
So my question is, you're getting all of these animals. You've got chickens, you're getting goats, you're getting rabbits. What are you going to do with all these animals?
Eat them.
You will eat them. Okay. So
well, eventually, I mean, We're getting eggs from the chickens.
Yeah.
And at this point, we only have 4. We're mainly using them, entirely using them for eggs.
Yeah.
Goats, you can get fibers, you can get milk. And eventually, if you want, goat meat is meant to be quite healthy. Rabbit meat is actually meant to be extremely healthy. If I
They're
remember.
both really good. I've had both goat and rabbit. They're both really tasty.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I've had either, so it'll be a new experience for me.
So I'll tell you, one of my retirement dreams used to be to move to southern Utah, raise goats and make cheese.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Got to come up here and get some of my goat milk.
Come up there and make goat cheese.
Yeah, I did just learn that mozzarella comes from goats, and I love mozzarella. So I'll have to see if that's, I know nothing about it at this point. But yeah, so if no banjo, did you get time to read?
No.
No.
I'm never reading again, Laura. I'm never reading again.
You're just done. So this is now the What Did Laura Read feature. Well, in a reading machine, in part because we did have a week of vacation, so I could, like when I'm home, I can't. But we are hoping to go, if the world, stays somewhat stable, we're hoping to go to Key West next February for our anniversary. Mm-hmm. So we found this beautiful collection of Hemingway at a secondhand bookstore. So I read The Sun Also Rises, and I read the beginning and the end of A Farewell to Arms. Mm-hmm. I didn't read the middle part because it's like, this is kind of the same character as the guy in The Sun Also Rises. So I just skipped to the end to see what happened, and I won't give spoilers.
Yeah. But it's good. You've been reading.
Yeah. So do you want to know who our guest is?
I was just that question was just coming out of my mouth. Who is our guest today?
Yeah, let me see. Can I read this? I put it in, I think, 14-point font this time. So
it's not the 0.14. Not that you sometimes come up with.
I've learned to double check that. And so Nancie Laird Young grew up as an Army brat, and that is all capitals, British regiment attached traveler, right?
I believe so.
Traveled with her family across the United States, Europe, and the Far East. Eventually, she grew up, married twice, had 3 great daughters, and careers in human services, academic administration, and advocacy for people with disabilities. These led to contributions to books and magazine articles, and eventually to positions in community social media management, content development, and strategy at WashingtonPost.com, Edmunds.com, LifetimeTV.com, and AOL/Time Warner, among others. The story of how she reconnected with her father and rediscovered herself is the topic of her memoir, Tea with Dad, Finding Myself in My Father's Life. Nancie is a principal in formation of a new small independent press because it's in 14 point font. See, I created a new word, font. Font. But it went on to page 2, and I couldn't get the page out, of a new small independent press opening for submissions in late 2023. And can you remind me, Nancie, what is the name of that press?
It's Coastal Colibri Press.
Coastal Colibri Press.
Still kind of, yes, we're kind of still working on it.
Okay.
And it may change. Everybody's got an opinion.
That is true. Especially in today's world, we all have an opinion. So, Michael, what is today's first beer?
What is today's first beer? So, disclaimer for everyone out there who cannot see, I do not have any of today's beers in front of me. I have a different beer entirely in front of me that has nothing to do with anything I'm pouring or pairing with these readings.
So do I.
I do.
I picked. Yeah, I picked one of my favorites from.
That's from an earlier episode.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have beers paired to these readings. So the first one is not available because it was a limited edition special release last year from Liftbridge Brewing in Stillwater, Minnesota. It is called Free the Bibs. It is a blood orange Hefeweizen. So Hefeweizen is a German wheat beer, very light, effervescent, kind of banana and clove flavors. And they've added blood orange to it, which brightens it up and gives it extra fruity kick. I chose this one to go with this reading because the theme of this reading is kind of, well, it's in the reading, surrender, and the release that comes along with that. So surrender in the sense of acceptance. And so I wanted something that was like, so when I read the reading, it was like the sun rising, sort of, or the sudden burst of light that came with this.
Would this be a good approximation of what it would look like?
No, it'd be much lighter.
Would it be much lighter? Okay.
Yeah.
I wondered if it
I
would
wasn't
be.
thinking so much of the actual color. I was thinking of the sensation of drinking. It's more that effervescence and the fruitiness and the little bit of tart, and it's just like bright.
A lightness of being.
Exactly, the lightness of being. There you go.
Perfect.
You got it.
So does that mean we're ready for our first reading?
It does mean we're ready, since neither of us have beers in front of us, so we can't talk about
Well,
whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I was thinking that describing would look like I would have liked it.
Yeah, probably.
I'll put it. Well, you said it's limited edition, so it's not.
You can't get it anymore. So.
Okay. Well, that's a shame. Go ahead. First reading.
This is from the prologue of the book and sets up how it is I came to move in with my father. I tried to take comfort in remembering that for the past 15 years, I had survived almost all the experiences on that list of stressors that shorten a human being's life, including 4 of the top 5: marital separation, dissolution of the marriage, my mother's death, and a serious medical episode of my own. Until now, I'd escaped imprisonment, number 3, since I still had a salary to garnish. I admit now to feeling then that 3 hots and a cot in a white-collar federal prison environment sounded more appealing than having my father step in. I heard they had libraries and lots of alone time. I fantasized about working out in the prison yard and all the free time I would spend writing. It would have been simple to resolve the tax issue when it first arose, but instead, overwhelmed about so much for so long, I had thrown the first letter and all subsequent ones into a large plastic box that stood in the corner of my office. I knew the problem wouldn't go away, and yet I hoped that magically it somehow would. I hoped that something might have been misfiled or miscalculated or calculated incorrectly. Surely a ridiculous error on their part, not mine, would be discovered, and they'd notify me before I had to sort through boxes of returns and supporting documentation. After the call from the office, I dug through the mound of unopened mail I'd thrown into the box of deal with later, and found all the IRS communications, including the warning notice advising me that unless I responded, my wages would be garnished. There it was, mixed in with everything else. Later had arrived. I finally told my father about the situation a few months after I'd used up what savings I'd put away in order to bridge the gap between income and expenses. I had meant to get around to fixing things, but just never managed to do it. I assured Dad it was nothing. I'd take care of it quickly. I knew I didn't owe any taxes, certainly not as much as they claimed, and vowed to fight any penalties and interest due, exponentially more than the alleged taxes owed since I'd delayed so long. Each month I'd write a check to Dad for rent and then ask him to hold it for a week, only to call him within a few days to ask him to hold on to it with all the others just a bit longer. This process repeated every month for about 10 months. I imagined my father on the other end of the line. Was he standing up or sitting in his recliner after having thought all of this through? Despite his age, my father stood soldier straight and moved, though more slowly than before, with the same grace of an athlete he had his whole life. His formerly platinum blonde hair was turning white now. I could envision him impeccably dressed in his golf shirt and khakis, his clear blue eyes intent on his mission of solving the problem I'd created, but had not handled. I waited to hear what he would say. It was, I've decided. You're moving in with me. I'm selling that house. I felt then processed as much as my brain was capable of handling through layers of depression-related numbness. I started to formulate an argument against my father's plan, but for the first time in years, I tried to count how many. It took too long. My heart recognized and embraced the blessed absence of anxiety and fear. This time I had no desire to prepare a defense or plead one. I'd hit bottom, Dad knew it, and now I accepted it, though we had not discussed how bad things were for me then. Any rational being observing me and my life at that time would have seen that it was not just about the taxes, it was about everything. So my response to my father stepping in at this time was different than it had been in the past. I did not rail against cross boundaries or parental interference as I had before. I did not feel judged. I didn't have the sense of giving up before I did everything I could to remedy the situation. Instead, I felt rescued and trusted that it would be all right. And I found it uncharacteristically easy to loosen my grip from the edge of the roof atop the flaming house of cards I'd been clinging to. Trust, and then free fall into the net he held. I felt only relief. I was grateful and someone had intervened. I was glad it was him. I let go and responded without hesitation, albeit weakly. Okay. And to myself, I said, I surrender.
That's a really beautiful opening. And I'm going to wrap kind of a few questions into one. It sounds like your father had maybe suggested before that you move in with him. You had sort of resisted before. This time you felt peace. Did that feeling of peace last, or did you end up having second thoughts?
He had not suggested I move in with him at all. This was the first time we really discussed it honestly. But my feelings were based on years and years of my mother and father rescuing me. Sometimes I didn't need rescuing. Sometimes it was because I was on a path they didn't feel was productive or the one they had envisioned for me. When my marriages dissolved, they always wanted me to come home and live near them so they could take care of me, which didn't make sense when I had children and jobs and things. So that was the difference this time. This time it was just me and just him. So there was peace. As you go through the book, you see there were times in the house after I moved in, there wasn't peace. There was still that kind of push and pull as he tried to very gently, unlike my mother, to suggest that I do things differently or to forget I was the age I was. And because I was sick, I'm sorry.
That sort of brings me to a question that I had as I read this. I do try to read the entire book in addition to the readings. I had actually sent it to me, like 11 months ago when we were about to step into a story, and my life kind of just keeps spinning busier and busier. But it's really in a lot of ways a story about compromise. You talk about how you had to compromise about your meal schedules, your rising and going to bed schedules, your politics, your everything. You had, what was it to have to sort of relearn to compromise at the age of 60 when you'd been alone for a long time doing exactly what you wanted to do?
Well, I had to remember that he was 80. And, when I moved in, he was about 80, 81. And he'd been living a life a certain way, too, for a long time. He was, he'd retired as a full colonel in the Army. I realized going through this process, not soon enough, but towards the end, that where I thought I'd always been the compliant child and the one who was the good one, and my brothers were wild and crazy. And what I realized was my brothers had always though they'd been welding crazy, they had always, to him, been compliant.
Mhm.
I had not. And not that I was rude or a rebel or whatever, but I questioned a lot. And this wasn't something, it set us up for a lot of tension, I think, when I was growing up. But I used to say to my brother, it's crazy. The things he's telling me are crazy. And he would say to me, it's not crazy talk, it's Colonel talk.
I like
He's used to, this is a man who is used to walking around the area and saying, this needs to be done, that needs to be done. Why isn't this done? Let's get this done. And he said, there's always somebody to do it. And I said, I didn't enlist, nor was I drafted. but I had enlisted to move in with him. I really wasn't drafted. It was a volunteer thing. I could have always said no.
Well, as an adult, definitely, yes. I mean, I'm thinking, in respect to being a child, is by military officer, which is the case with me too. And I've always said he took his job home. It was like being raised in boot camp. And
I think my dad was so good at leaving his job at work, we thought, that we didn't realize he still came home with the presence of the commander. And always smiling. He's a very handsome man, very dashing. And unlike a lot of the other fathers, he didn't drink. When he was home with us. It wasn't until I realized he was really home to be with my mom. He adored my mother, loved my mother. And he always said to me, I'd say to him, why didn't you go play golf with the other guys? Why didn't you go out on boats or do things a lot with the other men? And he said, I was away so much. I didn't think it was fair to your mother. And besides, I liked my family.
That's wonderful.
It was, but it was clear there was a pecking order, still a pecking order. And though we didn't always know whether mom was outranked him, she did in some areas.
Which I believe you talk about in the next reading.
But
Can I make a mention here? I think this is by a strange coincidence. We had planned your interview, 6 months ago or so. And it just so happened that your father did die this past month. And in a way, I think it's a beautiful tribute to him. So how old was he?
He was 92.
92. Okay. And as far as I know, he was in fairly good health.
He was in fairly good health to the last 2 years. The book covered a time where he had his first serious illness. And then his second when he had the stroke. And he always recovered. But it was a silent kind of deterioration. He had suffered from Agent Orange.
Okay.
So it had affected his heart and some of his organs. He was such a healthy person. I think that it didn't take him as quickly as it might have some people. And of course he had genes. His father lived to 104.
Wow. Yeah, that's kind of like my family. My dad is 81 and he is suffering with Agent Orange right now too. And but his dad lived to be 96 and he was perfectly healthy until the day he died, probably of an aneurysm. But there's no reason he should have died.
Dad, he was pretty healthy, and so it was hard to see until the last really. It started in February being really, I think, bad, and we still didn't see it because he was such a fighter. But he was angry. It became a battle of wills sometimes, and I was put in there was a role reversal. I had to be a parent, but he wouldn't. I mean, I worked 4 days to get him to go to the hospital before the July 4th weekend. I used to tease him and go, what is it about major holidays that those are the days you want to go in? Do you not have more to celebrate with at home? What is this? And so on July 4th, we took him in because it was clear that his kidneys weren't working well and his heart wasn't working well. And he died 2 days later. But he died, the last gift he gave us was making the decision himself to be taken off all of the equipment. That was
That's
basically keeping him.
profound.
He had gone into cardiac arrest in the emergency room about 6 hours after we got there, but they brought him back.
We are ready for beer number 2.
Okay.
Okay. Beer number 2 is a very simple pairing. It is Summit Twins Pills from Summit Brewing in St. Paul. Twins Pills because they teamed up with the Minnesota Twins baseball team. And so it's a baseball pairing. And that will become apparent when in the reading why it's a baseball pairing. Now, an interesting note on Summit Twins Pills. Summit Twins Pills is not a new beer. It's a rebranding of an old beer. So Summit has Keller Pills, which I think is one of the best Pilsners made in Minnesota. And they've just, when they signed this deal with the Twins to make a beer for the Twins, they just rebranded Keller Pills. And when they sent me the media package for Twins Pills, I said to Masako, I think this is rebranded Keller Pills. And I peeled the label, the wraparound label off of the can. And sure enough, it was a can of Keller Pills underneath.
They just put a new label on top of the old label.
Well, for the media package, if you get what's out here now, it's not that. But for the media package, that's what I got. I thought that was.
That's kind of mind blowing. Like you'd think you'd at least pretend, that it's something new.
Well, I had actually been told. I interviewed Mark Stutrud, the founder, owner, whatever of Summit, for a column in the Star Tribune a while back, and he told me they had this upcoming deal with the Twins, and it was a great way to rebrand Keller Pills. So
it kind of reminds me. It kind of reminds me of Elton John just kind of tweaking a couple words on "Candle in the Wind" and going. On for Princess Diana. Didn't you changed 3 words in a song you already wrote?
If you got it and it's good, why not?
There is that. It was still a beautiful song. So I think we are ready for reading number 2. Go ahead, Nancie.
Okay. It really is about how we were pretty much a platoon in my family. And my father was big on teamwork. He believed that we all had a role. We all had a position to play. And sometimes it was hard, as I mentioned before, to know whether mom was the manager of the team or he was. But this covers the summer that I really felt that things were different for me as a girl in our family, even though I was part of the team. And where I saw the division of labor between who my father, with regard to the children, who dad was responsible for and who my mom was responsible for. And that was when pretty much dad took over the boys and mom took over me. That summer brought more changes. One day mom called to me while I played baseball in the sandlot across from the house, as I'd done for the past 2 summers. I was proud of my ability to play baseball as well as, if not better than, the boys I played with. It was the one thing I still felt totally comfortable doing. I loved the slap of the ball hitting my mitt if I squatted behind home plate or caught a line drive. Loved the feeling of diving for the ball and spinning to throw it to someone else's waiting glove. And I loved hitting the ball. She and dad sat me down in the living room and she said, "You can't keep playing baseball with those boys." Why, I asked. I looked at my father. This couldn't be his idea. He knew I was as good at fielding, hitting, and double plays as the guys. He knew how important baseball was. He taught my brothers and me how to play. We all played together. You could be hurt, Nancie. How? I pointed out that anyone could be hurt, my brothers included. I always kept my eye on the ball and I never put my glove up in front of my face unless totally necessary, and then did not move it until the ball was no longer in play. I didn't stand too close to anyone with a bat. Once when younger, a boy whacked me with a bat because neither of us was paying attention. It was the last time I made that mistake. I really did not understand why we were having this conversation. There had only been that one time the other day while pitching when Frank surprised me by hitting a line drive that I caught in my solar plexus. It knocked me down and I lost my breath. The boys all ran to gather around me, helped me up, brushed the red dirt off my shirt and pants. I did not mention how much I liked that. Nancie, those boys are much bigger than you are, and they'll continue to be, Mom said. It's dangerous, honey. My father stepped in to help my mother. You're a pretty girl, Nancie. What if you get hit in the face? What if you get hit in the chest? My mother and I stared at him. I had no idea what he was talking about. I caught my mother's expression as she looked at him too. Did she roll her eyes? Then she said, thank you, Lowen. I'll handle this. And my father seemed relieved that he'd been dismissed. Mom became, as she seemed always to be after that time, the messenger bearing bad news. That's it. No more baseball. I'm sorry. Her tone reminded me that she didn't have to supply a reason, answer my questions, or entertain any appeals. The meeting was over. I hung up my glove.
Well, a very different day and age, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. That chapter goes on to her taking me out then to buy me clothes and take me to the officers' teas and luncheons. And I was literally groomed to be an officer's wife, I guess. You know.
Well, and I mean, it's very interesting. Michael, do you remember who the author was who wrote? It was Marilyn. What was her last name? She wrote about Above the Wild Blue.
We've had so many military.
Yeah, it was
writers.
Marilyn. I can't believe I forgot her last name. I want to say
the book. Yeah.
Marilyn Manson.
No.
Hang on, I can find this easily.
Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, she talks in her book. I'd say that she was growing up pretty much the same year as you were in an Air Force family. And she talks in her book about how there was a manual about how the wives behave, how the children must behave. And I'm not that far behind you, but I feel like things had changed a little bit by the time I was growing up, and that there was not quite as strong an emphasis on that, although we were still very much expected that you are not going to cast shame on our family with your behavior. You're not going to make the Air Force look bad with your behavior, especially overseas, you know, but even to the townspeople of whatever town we were living in. You know, your behavior reflects on you, on your family, and on the entire United States Air Force.
And so the United States of America.
Yep, that too, exactly. So one of the phrases in your book really jumped out at me. You talk about how growing up military affects our view of everything, and you give some examples, for example, that I kind of repeated myself, didn't I, of viewing moves as new start rather than an ending, which I always did too. I was very much taught that we're going on to the next new adventure. It was never we're leaving things behind. It was always we're forging ahead. But one thing really jumped out at me. You said we reacted to death differently than others. And I know I do, but I'm really curious how you react to death that is different from how other people do.
I think I speak a little in the book, and I didn't go into real depth about it, but at the time I was growing up, it was the Cold War first, and then we went into the Vietnam War. So death was always part of our community. When I was growing up, up until the Vietnam War, which was our, the Army, the military was over there as advisors in the early 60s. So where the country as a whole may not have experienced a lot of the soldiers, or the military men, young boys dying, we did. It was our community. And there were, although there would be community sorts of services, the families were moved immediately. If you were overseas, they were gone. They didn't stay and go through a funeral and whatever. They were packed up, moved out, and gone. And so it was on the periphery. You always felt it, but you didn't experience it. And then, of course, there was always you don't show emotion, and you're brave, and you're courageous. And so but there were signs. So I talk in the book about, coming home from high school. And we would walk, and before my father went to Vietnam, he took me out in the car. And this was one of the only times, and he claims he didn't do it, but I wouldn't have known this if he hadn't been the one. He never claimed he didn't do it. He would say things like, I don't remember that.
Uh-huh.
But he was a young man then. He was,
Right.
I was 16. I was 15 when he went to Vietnam. So he would have been 35 years old, 36 years
Okay.
old. And he took me out for a ride, and he said to me, listen, if something happens to me, this is what will happen. And he told me how a chaplain and someone of his rank would come to the house to give us the news. And he went through the whole thing. So when we started seeing the sedans driving through our neighborhood, and he was there during the Tet Offensive. So there was a lot going on, and we were in Texas. There was an artillery base, and there was El Paso, and I forget what Fort Bliss, and then I forget what the other base was close by, but lots of families. And they would show them on the news, the boys who had died, our evening fare on the news. But we would come home from school and see the sedans. And it was just so odd, because we would kind of slow down or walk, continuing our conversation, look down to see what street they were going down, think about who was on that street, who it could be, somebody's father, somebody's brother, but we'd keep going because we knew we'd find out soon enough. And I had the experience when my mother and father my mother flew to Hawaii to meet my father for R&R, rest and recreation. We were left for the week that she would be gone, or however long it was, and cared for, of course, by someone. And I was home that day because I didn't really feel well. And as I looked out the window, I saw a sedan pull up, and my mother had left that morning. And I will never forget how I felt. I sat down, I hid between the front window and the one that was near the doorway. And saw two men get out, and one was a chaplain. And I didn't put this in the book, but I hid, and the two men were there, and I guess the man leaned over and looked in and saw me on the floor, and then realized what I thought and started saying, no. He was the son-in-law of the woman staying with us. And he had just stopped to make sure she was okay. And
oh, wow.
He was in the neighborhood, and he was so apologetic. But I realized in that moment what it must be like. And I realized I didn't know how to reach my mother. My father had said to me, you call the Red Cross. You call it. He had given me all these instructions, but I was 15.
Right.
And so it was death. And I will tell you that when Dad died, I may cry now, but I worried that I wasn't emotional enough. And the doctors kept coming over to me while he was in cardiac arrest, or the nurses, are you all right? And I was going, I'm fine, because I'm very compartmentalized. I'm able to really compartmentalize feelings.
I had, I'm not going to go into the details, but a very, very traumatic, upsetting experience, life-changing experience the summer after my freshman year of college. And so as a result, I started college completely independent, paying for everything. And that was actually one of the comments that my trombone professor made to me. He pulled me into a meeting with all the other brass professors, and they said, we're concerned about you because you are on such an even keel all the time, and you shouldn't be. It's like, this is a bad thing to handle life well. And, and honestly, I look back on that, and in a way, they were wrong. I kind of was fine because was raised to say, you know what, life is going to constantly change and this is what you're going to do.
I think the danger is when we don't, and I think that was my issue a lot of times, was that I suppressed feelings instead of, I had to tell my father sometimes how I was feeling, because if he looked at me, he wouldn't have known.
Right.
And
right.
that's something
Very
that
good at that.
living with him, that feelings were legitimate and valid, and you could have them, but nobody was interested in them.
Right. There is some truth to that, and really it makes sense. In a military setting, you don't have time for feelings. There are bombs falling. You need to do what you need to do.
Yeah.
We, for better or worse, are way over time. We need to jump into beer number 3. But before we do, Michael, my son, the one who brews beer, was over here this morning. He and his friend had been hiking up at Tetagooch and Split Rock. And we were talking about books and brews, and he's very incensed that you have not picked one of his beers yet.
Which brewery?
Well, the Key and Stack Brewery. It's in his house in Iowa.
We can't get his beers here, so
I'll have to ask him to start importing them.
there you go.
So what is beer number 3?
Beer number 3 is another very simple pairing. There's a significant electrical shock in this next reading. And so the beer is Shock Top. The Belgian wit beer from ABInBev. The style of beer has nothing to do with the pairing. It's a name pairing. And just that simple. So Shock Top Belgian wit beer.
Belgian wheat beer.
Yeah.
All right. Reading number 3. Go ahead, Nancy.
This is the very first time that Dad was really sick. That's what started. This visit to the hospital indicated the start of his decline. Slow as it was, but we were there the next day when the cardiologist came in to see Dad. He informed us that Dad's heart was functioning at about 50%, and that because of that, blood was pooling, and they were concerned about clots and strokes. This precluded any of the procedures that might improve things for fear he would throw a clot and have a major stroke. Rachel, my oldest daughter, looked at the doctor. So what options are possible, she asked. Unfortunately, in this situation, there's nothing available that wouldn't put him at risk for a major heart attack. He looked at my father. We'll stabilize you. We'll get your oxygen levels up, maybe send you home with some oxygen. I said nothing, but Rachel looked at the doctor and firmly but sweetly said, oh, there has to be another option. Then she looked at my father and said, we'll get you stabilized, and then we're taking you across the bridge. We'll get you a second opinion at the Heart Center at Inova in Virginia. It's not far from my house, so it will be easy for us to get back and forth. The doctor said nothing. My father said nothing. Rachel smiled a lovely smile at the doctor and said, I've got to go make a call. I'll be back. I walked over and sat by Dad's bed. If I need to have oxygen, it's over, he said. I looked at him. I mean it. I can't play golf with a tank of oxygen. I thought he was trying to joke, but when I looked at him again, he was serious. He seemed to be telling me that if living required oxygen, his life was over. I said something he used to say to me when I was a child, worried or afraid and anticipating the worst. Let's wait and see what happens, Dad. Then I added, you can't go anywhere right now. I don't have a plan B. I laughed. He grinned at me. It was true. I couldn't bear for him to die. That was not part of my plan. And that is pretty much it. And so I'm in plan B.
Here we are.
Yeah. But I think that conversation was so important because it made me think. He told me how he felt, and it was really a quality of life issue for him. And it made me realize that he might not make it to 105 because we were trying to beat Pa's record. And so he and I began to have those talks. And that was 3 or 4 years ago.
It reminds me of a conversation I had. Probably the best teacher I ever had for all my education was my high school band teacher, Mr. Cuno. John Cuno, for, all you Osceoites listening, everybody remembered him. He died quite young he was in his 50s, and his wife was telling me that he was in a car accident when he was 19, and it left him in chronic pain the rest of his life. And she said when he got into, I think it was his 50s, that the damage just kept progressing, and it reached the point where he couldn't do the two things he loved. He went on a monthly hiking trip every single month of his life with friends, and he played the trumpet. And it reached a point where he couldn't do those two things anymore. And she said he wore out. He was so unhappy because he couldn't do either of the two things that he really loved.
I think that a lot of Dad's distress in the last year was really quality of life issues. I mean, we got him a chair lift, so that he could go up the stairs, or whatever they call those things. He did eventually had to have oxygen. But we got him a portable one so he could still go to the casino. And he had a scooter, he had a little scooter. But the fact was, in the last 4 or 5 months, he was weak. And so when he wasn't, if I didn't drive, if I didn't help him to the car and things like that, I think it must have been very hard for him. And he would sit there and say, "This is crap. This is terrible." And this is not a man who did that. He was always so optimistic and whatever. Right. So it
really came out in your book, how cheerful he was, how he had a sense of humor, how he was always encouraging you not to take life too seriously. And I want to focus on a line that he said, that you quote in the book. He said, "I've had a good life. I'm satisfied." What does it mean for us, in your mind or in his mind, to say that we've had a good life and we're satisfied, which is really a way of saying, I think I'm ready to go if I need to go?
I think my mom and dad were really good at getting us out of the clouds and down to basics. I remember when my mom was dying, I asked her if she was afraid. And she thought about it and she said, "No, I've had a good life." She said the same thing. She said, "I loved your father. We had a very good marriage. I got to travel the world, and I had you 3 children." And my father said the same thing. He said, "I had the love of my life. I'm proud of my 3 kids. I got to see my great-grandchildren." And so those things remind me when I am worried about money, or worried that I haven't done enough of something, or am behind on laundry. Because he used to say to me, "The world won't end if the laundry doesn't get done."
I actually read that line just last
and I would sit and go, what do we strive for? Shouldn't we be striving for good relationships with our children and our families and the world around us, and just thinks more simply? I think right now we're dealing with looking around this house and going, what are we going to do with all this stuff? And what I realized is my dad and mom were very worried about, people fighting over things. And I just looked at my brother, I said, "What do you want?" And he went, "I want my West Point helmet and my sword, and maybe some of those steins from Germany." And
I laughed when I read in your book about all the steins, because my parents have like 5 million Hummels and a whole bunch of stuff.
Apparently, my mother is not the only woman who insisted on buying one of each thing for each of her children.
No, my mom didn't do that. She did have Hummels that were specifically for me and specifically for my sister. And for some reason, she always got them kind of like in pairs. But if you know Hummels at all, there's a kind of matching set of a little boy and a little girl in a tree.
Yep.
And for some reason, every time she got stuff like that, my sister always got the girl and I always got the boy. and as, I don't know, I mean, not that it bothered me, but as an adult, I kind of go, why was that?
What's the logic in that? Yeah.
I am curious, but like when we went to the bullfights in Spain, my sister got the beautiful señorita and I got the matador, and it was always like that. I always got the male figure of whatever it was. Like,
that's a book in itself.
Yeah.
I think that what's been very interesting is the things that I thought I would want. I want, her goddess of mercy statues because she loved them and she collected them. And I want the lamps by their bedside table. Mainly, and it was funny. I wanted the things from Taiwan. My brothers wanted the things from Germany, and
so that worked out well.
Yeah. But otherwise we're feeling guilty about not wanting all this stuff, but our kids don't want it.
That's good though. I mean, we have a lot of stuff in this house, Michael and I, and our potential realtor and our movers have all discussed it all. But there is a part of me that's like, I just want less stuff. I want to ask you one last question before we have to wrap up. This is a wonderful story of reconnecting with your father, of a chance that many people don't get to know their parent in a way that we simply normally don't get to by living with him for years on end. What is your goal in writing a book about living with your father? What is the message that you hope readers will take away from it?
I think there are actually two. And one is we don't really know even our own story.
That's profound.
One of the things I learned in writing this book was how little I knew myself. But there was someone here who told me who I was, reminded me of the child I'd been and how I'd grown. We forget those things. We might remember episodes, but he could tell me, this is the kind of child you were. We always knew that we had to worry about this with you or not worry about that with you. You always take care of those things. And the other thing is we didn't know the stories. There's a chapter in the book about my great uncle Al, who I'd always heard had 3 wives at the same time. And one of them was Chinese. And it turned out my father informed me that was not the case. And then what we didn't know at the time, we met his grandchildren, his granddaughters. And they were talking to us and they said, oh, he had 4 wives.
Oh, wow.
And Dad said, I want you to know. Well, first Dad said, I want you to know he was never married to all those women at the same time. And one of them very calmly said, well, actually there were 4 wives and he was married to 2 of them at the same time.
Oh boy.
And my dad went, really? And I went, my book's wrong. So yeah, I enjoyed that part of the book because, we have all these story families. I mean, even now, people talk and people tell each other stories. And it's just like, okay, you don't know the whole truth. Stories get twisted. Yeah. And that was such a perfect example of it, that you spend your life believing this guy had 3, 4 wives. He had a Chinese wife. It turns out she wasn't Chinese. And I think the other thing I learned was that you may not resolve all the issues that you have with somebody. I haven't. I mean, to this day, I was mad at him this morning for something, and he's gone. But I understand more about.
That's a great gift.
It's a wonderful gift, and it helps you, I think, be kinder to yourself. Because you're kind of reminded all of us are fallible and all of us are human. And
I think it helps you be kinder to the person that you're upset with too, because, I have people like that in my life who have just done egregious things they shouldn't have done. And there are things that will not be allowed to continue. And yet I can look at it and say, but I know where they're coming from. I know why they are the way they are. I'm not going to continue the relationship, but I also don't harbor anger. I don't seek revenge. I don't write nasty books about the evil things I'm going to do to them and change them by one letter, because I get it. We all came from whatever difficult circumstances. Everybody has something.
I learned that he did the best he could.
Yep.
He really did. And when I think about where he came from and where he got to, it's in both of my parents. It's pretty damn amazing. So I would urge people to try. I mean, I understand there are situations where it may not be possible, you may not want to, but if you really yearn to have a relationship with somebody, I think you should try and be open to knowing you may not like what you have to hear. But it's better to have the whole story than have the wrong story.
That's really true. That's very true. And there are so many people in this world who just flat out have the wrong story. And you can only try and tell them maybe there's more to it. So at this point, Nancie, where can readers find you online?
They can find me at nancielairdyoung.com, which is my website, and it has all of the links to all my social. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and Nancie is spelled with an Nancie. So it's just nancielairdyoung.com, and the book is Tea with Dad, Finding Myself in My Father's Life.
And I really enjoyed reading it. Michael, where can people find you and where can people find us?
I am at aperfectpint.net and aperfectpint. We are at booksandbrews.net and Brews on Instagram and Books and Brews with Laura Vosika and Michael Agnew on Facebook.
You got it all out. Plus, we do have a YouTube channel, which I mentioned. It's like a string of letters and more letters and capital letters and lowercase letters that to it. I don't.
In a bunch of letters, you'll find us.
If you're lucky, scroll. No, if you put in Books and Brews, there are actually a few YouTube channels that are called that. But ours has a picture of the two of us standing next to a sign. And I think we're up to, we should have more subscribers. So if you subscribe, I'll send you a personal thank you letter. Actually, I'll just add that to the letters you and are writing. Here are a few more for you. You can find me. Oh, there go my musical clocks. I don't know if you can hear those. You can find me at lauravosika.com or bluebellschronicles.com, which lead to the same site. If you really want to know more, you can go to chrisandlaurapowell.com, which has links to some of our music and some of his inventions and all kinds of interesting stuff. In my biased opinion. The upcoming events, Nancie?
No, not for a while. I think we're going to be focusing on settling all of this, and Dad will be interred with Mom, join Mom at Arlington Cemetery. And then I'll see, but I'm just kind of taking a break and working a little on some books to see which one says I want to be it.
Right. I know that feeling.
Yep. So I'm kind of getting back to basics and just kind of breathing right now.
Yep. For me, my only upcoming event is that Gabriel's Horn Press is accepting poems in traditional forms on the subject of laughter. And Michael, anything for you?
I got no events. For everybody out there, you must think I don't have a life at all. I don't have any events ever. I don't read anything. I have a life.
But you're going on tour and you forage for mushrooms, right? Is that season coming up?
Oh, that season's already in, but I haven't foraged at all this year.
Oh.
I went out once.
So the last question of the night is,
who do we have next time?
Okay, I say this every month, but every month it's true. We have a New York Times bestselling author coming up next month. His name is Robert Bidinotto, and he is the Vigilante author, as he calls himself. He's the creator of Dylan Hunter, the thriller world's new face of justice. Do you hear my other clock going off, by the way?
Yes.
Husband loves clocks. So we've got I think about 50 clocks and all right on the hour. So for about 3 minutes, one after another goes on at the top of the hour. They each have their, melody and sound and all. So since watching The Lone Ranger and reading Batman comics in the 50s and 60s, Robert has been passionate about the principle of justice. He started writing nonfiction on the topic of justice in his teens. Now it's the central theme of his fiction, too. He was previously editor and chief contributor to the widely acclaimed Criminal Justice, that's a question mark in case you couldn't hear it in my voice, The Legal System versus Individual Responsibility, with the foreword by John Walsh of TV's America's Most Wanted. Prior to writing fiction, he was best known for his article, Getting Away with Murder, in the July 1988 issue of the Digest, and wrote investigative pieces on environmental scares, and later lectured and wrote extensively about environmentalism. And now he is a New York Times bestselling author of the Dylan Hunter series.
All right. Well, that sounds very interesting. I look forward to that. Nancie, I want to thank you for joining us today and chatting with us. This has been Books and Brews, episode 41. Thanks for joining us out there. Cheers.